He is remembered today as a martyr of the abolitionist cause, an icon to leftists across the United States of America who see in him a hero for a cause not all too different from their own. His name was John Brown, and contrary to the memory of him which prevails in popular consciousness, Brown was nothing other than a psychopathic murderer whose lust for blood defined his life, death, and legacy. In examining his crimes, his victims, and the network that enabled his actions, we find John Brown to be not a freedom fighter, but one of the most destructive and whitewashed political terrorists that 19th century America ever encountered. To truly understand John Brown, we must begin with his theological underpinnings. Brown lived in his own personal world, where the chattel slavery of the 1850s was not a complex social evil to be overcome, but a singular, personified sin committed by the irredeemable Southern sinners, who he believed to be fit only for extirpation. At the helm of this extremism was a series of ultra-religious Unitarian ministers, including Theodore Parker and Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Parker, for his part, referred to black people as the most docile and pliant race, always prone to mercy, but indolent. Higginson, on the other hand, stated that Africans seem the world's perpetual children, prolonging the privilege of childhood throughout their life. This is important to note because it reveals that these men, both heavy influences upon John Brown, viewed slavery as wrong only because they believed black Americans to be so childish and unintelligent that it was immoral to keep them in slavery, as it would be akin to enslaving a child. This ultra-religious environment taught men like John Brown that they had been granted a celestial license for their belief system, as they were instruments of a vengeful God. The hatred of the South, manufactured by such Northerners, allowed these individuals to project their own sins onto a demonized region and claim virtuous superiority. Brown became the perfect vessel for this projected virtue, a murderer whose violence could be laundered into sainthood by a Northern intellectual elite eager to prove its own purity. As he himself stated to Ralph Emerson, John Brown believed that it would be better that a whole generation of men, women, and children should pass away by a violent death than that one word of either the Golden Rule or the Declaration of Independence should be violated. John Brown's hatred for Southerners found its first bloody expression in the dark hours of May 24th to 25th, 1856, along Pottawatomie Creek, Kansas, in what would go down as the Pottawatomie Massacre. Here, Brown committed his first large-scale atrocity, through which he intended to incite a paralyzing terror throughout the South. That night, Brown, 4 of his sons, his son-in-law, and 2 companions, descended upon the homes of simple Southern settlers, not slaveholders, but mere farmers, whose greatest crime was their presence on land contested by Northern emigrant societies. At one cabin, Brown and his men dragged a settler named James Doyle from his home, along with his family. Doyle, for one, was shot point-blank in the face. His sons, William and Drury, were subjected to savage mutilation. William was stabbed in the face, slashed over the head, and shot in his side. Drury was beaten and hacked to death, his fingers and arms severed in the process. After he fell, his skull was cut open, and he was stabbed repeatedly long after his death. At the home of a certain Allen Wilkinson, the elderly man was taken from his bed as his wife begged for his life. Her pleas were ignored by Brown's men, who hacked Wilkinson to death just as they killed the other preceding 3 unarmed men. At the James Harris cabin, the raiders seized a man named William Sherman. They marched him to the creek's edge, where one blow from a broadsword severed his left hand, leaving it hanging by a strand of flesh as he raised it in a futile defense. Further blows opened his skull, and he fell into the shallows, where chunks of his brain drifted off downstream. This massacre accomplished nothing except for transforming wives and children into widows and orphans. Mahala Doyle, whose husband and 2 sons were murdered, and whose 3rd son, then a mere boy, was spared only by her desperate pleas, later wrote to Brown days prior to his execution in 1859, quote, "You can now appreciate my distress when you, then and there, entered my house at midnight and arrested my husband and 2 boys and took them out of the yard, and in cold blood shot them dead in my hearing. You can't say you done it to free our slaves. We had none, and never expected to own one, but has only made me a poor, disconsolate widow. Oh, how it pained my heart to hear the dying groans of my husband and children. If this scrawl gives you any consolation, you are welcome to it." Unquote. If this letter does not underscore just how vast the chasm was between Brown's purported cause and his actual targets, I'm not sure what else could do a better job. Far from being condemned in the North, these murders were excused by a propaganda campaign in the abolitionist press, which shamelessly ridiculed the victims as having gotten exactly what they deserved. Emboldened by impunity, John Brown escalated his campaign with the raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859. His plan was to seize a federal arsenal and spark a violent slave insurrection. Despite his hopes, not a single slave joined his fateful endeavor, as Brown's plan was predicated on a catastrophic misunderstanding of Southern society, a society based upon bonds of paternalistic duty. Brown had predicted that hundreds of slaves would flock to his standard, and yet not a single local enslaved person voluntarily joined his stand. Instead, the first victim of his raid was Hayward Shepard, a free black baggage handler for the railroad. Shepard, a working man with a family, was investigating a train delay when he encountered John Brown's raiders. As he fled to warn the community, he was shot in the back and killed. Here was a freed black man, murdered by those claiming to be his liberators for the crime of protecting his white neighbors, a community that had afforded him his freedom and livelihood. As the raid descended into chaos, it went on to claim countless blameless lives. Mayor Fontaine Beckham, an unarmed elderly man, was shot and killed while attempting to observe the situation. One account by David S. Reynolds, author of John Brown, Abolitionist, goes as follows. A railroad agent and the mayor of Harper's Ferry, Fontaine Beckham was beloved by both blacks and whites. Although he held slaves, he had a clause in his will liberating them upon his death. He had spent the morning in the railway ticket office helping the wounded Shepard Hayward and advising citizens to stay indoors until the danger had passed. Beckham should have followed his own advice. Several times he went out unarmed to see the state of the battle. He peeped around a water tank when Edwin Coppock in the engine house got a bead on him with his rifle. Coppock fired twice at Beckham. The second bullet tore through his shoulder into his upper body, killing him almost instantly. Grocery store owner Thomas Borley was subsequently gunned down in the street. Following this, Brown's men murdered George W. Turner, a farmer. None of the aforementioned men were combatants. Brown's gang also took hostages, including Lewis Washington, the great-grandnephew of George Washington, stealing his familial heirlooms to desecrate the symbols of the heritage they sought to obliterate. When Colonel Robert E. Lee's Marines stormed the engine house, they found Brown using these terrified hostages as human shields. Brown had never acted alone. His actions were sponsored by a network of wealthy and influential Northern abolitionists known as the Secret Six, which included Gerrit Smith, George Luther Stearns, Theodore Parker, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Samuel Gridley Howe, and Franklin Benjamin Sanborn. These men provided the money, weapons, and moral sanction for Brown's terrorism, with industrialist George Stearns personally funding the purchase of hundreds of rifles and the infamous pikes, which he envisioned would be tools for the enslaved peoples to use to eviscerate their masters. Minister Thomas Higginson, for his part, boasted, quote, "I am always ready to invest money in treason." Following Brown's capture, Gerrit Smith had himself committed to an insane asylum. Howe, Sanborn, and Stearns fled to Canada. Meanwhile, the Northern intellectual elite, particularly Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, canonized the political terrorist as a martyr for the abolitionist cause. Emerson declared Brown's gallows would be as glorious as the cross. Thoreau proclaimed him an angel of light. Churches tolled bells for his execution, and his body was paraded through northern cities in a frenzy of mourning. This response from the North sent an unambiguous message to the people of the South that their people, their lives, and their society were legitimate targets for extermination by any means necessary, convincing even moderate Southerners that coexistence with a region that celebrated their slaughter would be impossible. John Brown was not a psychopath, nor was he even an especially unwell man. John Brown is simply the perfect example of what happens when somebody believes in their own self-righteousness more than they do in the sanctity and humanity of their fellow citizen. In the words of Harry S. Truman, John Brown was, to quote, "a fanatic, a murderer, and a troublemaker. One of the best things Robert E. Lee ever did was to hang old John Brown."